purpose of this series is to provide an overview of select vintage and modern games, their pros and their cons, and what are the essential books and items that you need to play them. With different editions, multiple games appearing to be similar on the surface, and a huge variety of supplements and expansions, newcomers, and even some veterans, can often find it daunting and a confusing place to be, and this series hopes to lend a helping hand. This time, we are heading into the 2000s and the OGL era of role-playing games, with Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition. The history of 3rd edition begins with the purchase of TSR by Wizards of the Coast in 1997. Facing financial problems, not for the first time in its history, TSR began to lose traction in the gaming hobby world. There was a lot of blame speculation at the time for this. The rise of more narrative-driven games such as Vampire the Masquerade, the popularity of collectible card games such as Magic the Gathering, a loss of interest in role-playing games on the whole. None of these really ran true. Many gamers I knew played a number of different games. It was not overly common to find someone that only played Magic. For myself, I played and collected a number of games, including the card game Jihad, later renamed to Vampire the Eternal Struggle, Dungeons & Dragons, and games you'll find elsewhere within this series of videos. Whatever the actual reality of it was, TSR ended up in the hands of Wizards of the Coast, the publisher of Magic, and from 1998, the incredibly popular Pokemon game. Magic had debuted in 1993 and catapulted the company to the success that enabled it to stump up the $25 million it needed to purchase TSR, and with it, Dungeons & Dragons. Although Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition would continue to be published until 2000, with its final supplements coming out in that year, Wizards were pretty fast out of the blocks in breaking ground for a 3rd edition. Wizards ran quite an extensive playtest period for 3rd edition, which I felt privileged to be a part of. I had submitted some article ideas to Dragon Magazine to follow on from my previous articles for 2nd edition on King Arthur and a mythical representation of the Dark Ages England. Off the back of these, I was asked to rework them for 3rd edition, and my gaming group was added to the playtesters. It was actually a pleasant experience, with regular two-way feedback, and the likes of Kim Mohan from Wizards' side more than happy to field questions and concerns. Several facets to 3rd edition did not escape my notice during this period. For example, more emphasis on a skill-based system with different costs according to class, unified mechanics that included a critical success mechanic. Critical hits were not a part of the official core rules until 3rd edition. A unified level progression system, with balance being structured on a per-level basis into the classes, rather than handled by different rates of progress. And larger emphasis in rebalancing of ability scores and their impact, leading, for example, to 2 charisma-based character classes that boosted the worth of that particular ability. A lot of this seemed very familiar, especially as a player of Middle-earth role-playing and Rolemaster as well as D&D. In Rolemaster, the mechanics are unified. Skills are costed per class, named profession in that game's vernacular, and so on. Running through the rules, it did seem at times that this new edition of D&D was being developed along a D20-driven Rolemaster Lite template. And pieces fell into place when I twigged that Monty Cook was the lead designer. Monty's name was plastered all over the credits for a number of Rolemaster supplements, and I'm pretty sure a fair few of the elements of 3rd edition were driven by that pre-Wizards experience. For me, though, this wasn't a bad thing. I like both games, and games borrowing from each other or being influenced by each other is a natural way of the world. With the playtest period over, 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons finally hit shelves through July to October in 2000, with the releases of the Player's Handbook, once more the key rulebook following the tradition set by 2nd edition, the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual. An important key here is that there was no more advanced prefix. Dungeons & Dragons and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons were no longer separate entities. In fact, it was more than 3rd edition dropping the advanced title and basic D&D being no more. If you look through 3rd edition, you can see trace elements of the basic rules in there. Perhaps the most impactful thing introduced by the release of 3rd edition, however, came in the form of the Open Game License, the OGL. Back through the 1980s and 1990s, TSR became infamous for litigating anything that it deemed to be cutting into Dungeons & Dragons, notably Dangerous Journeys and the Roll Aid series of supplements, published by Games Designers Workshop and Mayfair respectively. This behaviour saw all manner of attempts by companies to publish material for Dungeons & Dragons without specifically saying so. This manifested in the name changing of game terms, for example, hits to kill instead of hit points, use of different stat block structures, and so on. The laws protecting games, however, are a bit of a murky deep. The general party line is that you cannot copyright game mechanics, but you can copyright the actual representation of the game. The OGL got around all of this. Essentially, it permits a publisher to use the mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons and those elements of the game that are not specifically defined as intellectual property. They also agree to make portions of the content that they create open for others to similarly use. It meant that Wizards could lay down a reasonable statement of, "We won't sue you unless." It gave people the freedom to publish material with a confidence that they weren't going to get sued, and formed the foundation of a community of creators. Alongside the OGL came the D20 license. This was a bit more extensive, but basically it allowed publishers to create content for Dungeons & Dragons, not just its mechanics, with certain limitations. The pros of both the OGL and the D20 license was that creators and consumers of D&D content had a wide open vista to play in. Hundreds, if not thousands, of OGL and D20 supplements and games were published, and hundreds of game publishers found a way into the industry. The cons were that hundreds, if not thousands, of supplements and games were published, and hundreds of game publishers found a way into the industry. But just as with the .com bubble, this led to a saturation, to a very broad spectrum of quality, and a very wobbly foundation upon which all of these new companies stood. It was bound to fail, and it did. If you look at the number of companies that are still around from the early to mid-2000s explosion, you'll see just how hard that bubble burst. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to the core. The 3rd edition game was supported by 2 introductory formats: the D&D adventure game with map tiles and counters, and the adventure Caves of Shadow, which was a free download from the Wizards of the Coast website. The latter included rudimentary rules and pre-generated characters to a standalone game that introduced the basics of role-playing. A handy free conversion booklet also came out at the same time as the game was released, available as a free download and as a free pickup in local stores, conventions and so on. The initial release of the Player's Handbook also came with a CD-ROM containing a character generator program that was, well, shall we say that it was pretty to look at. Sourcebooks were plentiful. From 2000 to 2003, Wizards had published over 20 volumes of new spells, classes, monsters, magic items and more, far outstripping previous editions for the same period of time. Standouts here include the Hero Builder's Handbook, which is still useful today, the Manual of the Planes, which is far more a construction toolkit for dimensions than the guide to the D&D multiverse that its 1st edition counterpart was. Deities and Demigods, which included a generation system for gods on a line similar to the Immortals rules from Basic, and the Epic Level Handbook. One of the things that 3rd edition made a great effort to do was to make the game balanced from 1st through to 20th level of play. This is an area previous editions had fallen down on. The original edition did not conceive of characters at such high levels, and both 1st and 2nd edition AD&D started to break down beyond around level 12 or so. The BECMI series for Dungeons & Dragons had created a coherent level and play structure from 1st through to 36th level, with a hard cap at 36th, excepting Divine Ascension. With 3rd edition, the core rules presented a soft cap at 20th level, with such things as spell progressions ending there. The Epic Level Handbook changed that by creating a whole new scope of play, in some ways comparable to the Master level from BECMI, and effectively removing any cap on character development. It did, however, maintain a membrane division between the 20th level standard maximum and the 21st level that heralds the beginning of epic play. 2 monster volumes added to the Monster Manual. the Monster Manual 2 in 2002, and the Fiend Folio in 2003, carrying on the 3rd edition tradition of reusing book titles. Along with these came Savage Species, a fantastic book that introduced methods of playing monsters as characters in a balanced way, giving monsters classes and providing rules for level progression. This book reformulated a lot of the way that monster statistics were calculated, including a re-evaluation of the various types such as undead and monstrous humanoid. These changes would see fruition a few months later. In July of 2003, Wizards unveiled a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons, sort of. This edition, labelled 3.5, updated and expanded the core rulebooks in accordance with the past 4 years of observation. 3.5 brought things even further into line, removing all elements of 3rd edition that were still out on a limb and fully bringing all of the changes introduced into books such as Savage Species. Alongside the release of 3.5, Wizards published free conversion downloads for the 3rd edition books to date, so the blow of such a relatively quick release was somewhat softened. The march of hardcover sourcebooks continued through 3.5, with a further 3 core monster volumes, Monster Manuals 3 through 5, a series focusing on monsters of specific types, the Draconomicon, Libris Mortis, Lords of Madness, 2 Fiendish Codexes, and Drow of the Underdark. Another on environments, Frostburn, Sandstorm, Stormwrack, Cityscape and Dungeonscape, and further rule and player option expansions. The Complete series, which reworked much of the material from the previous class-specific 3rd edition splat books, the Book of Vile Darkness, which was released during 3rd edition's run, and its companion, the Book of Exalted Deeds, the Unearthed Arcana of optional rules, Heroes of Battle, Heroes of Horror, Weapons of Legacy, Magic of the Incarnum, and Tome of Magic and the Tome of Battle, and second volumes for both the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. Into 2007, the essential 3.5 components were wrapped up into the Rules Compendium, the Magic Item Compendium, and the Spell Compendium, along with 2 volumes describing world-shattering evil in Exemplars of Evil and Elder Evils. All in all, more than 50 hardback volumes were released for 3.5. Now this, you may be saying, can only be a good thing. A game fully supported with regular releases, and yes, you would be right to say that. However, most volumes contained a collection of elements, some new prestige classes, some new spells, some new feats, which meant keeping track of all of these elements that players could draw upon to generate and develop characters became a more and more impossible job than it had been in 2nd edition, with its plethora of PHBR releases. Add to this the chaos of additional material released under OGL and D20 licenses, and the sheer volume of published options for 3rd edition became untenable. I very much doubt any single gaming group could scratch the surface of it all. Let me know in the comments if you managed to get more than a passing use out of the majority of the books released for the game. So finally, Wizards decided to take stock. There is an old, almost truism within the world of Dungeons & Dragons, not so much with other games, that the core books need to be revamped and sold every few years for it to be financially viable. Historically, this is exactly what we have seen, usually within a 5 to 6 year basis. It happened with 1st edition when the core books shifted to orange spines, and with 2nd edition when they shifted to black covers. 3.5 was the equivalent revision for 3rd edition. By 2007, Wizards had decided that they needed a brand new release of the game to keep things going, to generate another peak of sales, and so, in 2008, 4th edition was released. Now, there won't be a video on 4th edition because, simply put, I've never played it beyond the cut-down versions used for board games such as Wrath of Ashardalon and Castle Ravenloft. I bought the core rulebooks, I read them, I put them back on my shelf, and a few years later I sold them. As a set of board game rules, they are fun. As a role-playing game under the mantle of Dungeons & Dragons, they are very much lacking. So anyway, we'll go more into that when I get to covering the history of D&D from 3.5 to 5th editions. To wrap up this history section, I'll briefly touch on campaign settings and adventures. By and large, 3rd edition had 2 campaign settings released for it in full, the Forgotten Realms and Eberron. Eberron was a brand new setting designed for 3rd edition, while the Forgotten Realms had been around since 1st. Greyhawk was present as a sort of default world. Basically, if you played 3rd edition straight from the core rulebooks, you were more or less in Greyhawk. A few odds and sods were released to support Greyhawk, but mainly in its capacity as a living campaign organised by the RPGA. A few other mini-settings received limited releases, such as the interesting Ghostwalk setting. Beyond Wizards' official D&D releases, you could find campaign settings aplenty, including 3rd edition renditions of Judges Guild's Wilderlands and Moorcock's Melniboné. Hundreds of them. Through 3rd edition's run, Wizards sort of got out of the adventure writing business. Not completely, though. They did release several adventures, but perhaps fewer than they had been expected, given their sourcebook output. Standouts here include the original adventure path, starting with the Sunless Citadel for low-level characters, to the Bastion of Broken Souls that would take them up to 20th level. Later on, more traditional format adventures would be released, such as Barrow of the Forgotten King and Red Hand of Doom. The Fantastic Locations series presented an adventure with a large battle map for use with miniatures. And in 3rd edition's final period, Wizards fell back onto the one thing that has always sold: nostalgia, with the Expedition series of hardback adventures, Ruins of Greyhawk, Demonwed Pits, Underwood Mountain, and, yes, surprise, surprise, Castle Ravenloft. Wizards also regularly puts free adventures up onto its website. This relative deficit of adventures from Wizards was more than taken up by OGL and D20 publishers. In the swamp of thousands here, there are some good gems. Some of Goodman Games' Dungeon Crawl Classics adventures from this time are worth checking out, as are some of AEG's. There are far too many multi-level dungeon crawls in the mix, and some really, really daft ideas, such as the world's largest dungeon. Good gems, but a lot of dross. And that is our potted history of 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. It began with a vision and a purpose, and ended up as a sprawling, incoherent mess of options, and even more options. The core mechanics for 3rd edition are vastly simplified from its predecessors, first by making everything mathematically calculable. For example, the bonus for an ability score is equal to that score's value subtracted by 10 and divided by 2. And second, by making every major roll one 20-sided die, plus modifiers, versus a target. This target might be a difficulty class for a skill check or a saving throw, or armour class when rolling against an opponent to hit them. They equate to the same thing. Modifiers mostly come from class, level, and ability scores. Things get complicated when options are brought into the mix that modify the modifiers, especially if they do so conditionally. This complication occurs mainly with feats, special skills and abilities characters pick up every few levels. Many feats have requirements, including the possession of other feats, which sets up for chains of feats similar in ways to skill chains often found in computer games. As for skills, these cover a broad spectrum of capabilities, from crafting to sneaking to riding horses and so on. Skills are designated as class or cross-class, depending on which class your character follows. Class skills can be developed at twice the rate of cross-class skills. All characters gain levels using the same experience point table, which is a change from previous sections. Level determines skill points to spend on skills, the acquisition of feats, ability score improvements, attack bonuses and saving throw bonuses. Class determines the progression of these two latter elements. A class that is good at combat will gain a +1 bonus to attack every level. There are 3 saving throw types, Fortitude, Reflex and Will, for which a class will be rated as good or poor. Good saving throws carry better bonuses per level than poor ones. Multiple attacks are handled in groupings of 5, in terms of base attack bonus due to level. After every grouping of 5, another grouping is started. For example, a fighter gains +1 to base attack per level. At 5th level, he has a base attack bonus of +5. At 6th level, he gains a second grouping. His base attack becomes +6 and +1. Similarly, at 11th level, where it becomes +11, +6, +1, after his second grouping reaches +5, and at 16th, when it becomes +16, +11, +6, +1. Ability scores are rolled on a basis of 3 to 18 and then modified by choice of race. Unlike previous editions, there are no percentile subcategories for any score, no limits on ability score modifiers by class, and no multiple modifiers per ability, except in the case of spell users. This means a strength of 18 carries a +4 bonus, regardless of class, and that bonus is used whether the character is attacking, breaking down a door, lifting a gate, or whatever. Ability scores do not have an upper limit. Characters improve 1 score every 4 levels, and several feats also provide ability score modifiers, as do certain magic items. It is not uncommon for a player character to achieve a score of 20 in a primary ability score in relatively short order. There are 11 core classes, each of which provides a unique mix of ability score focus: barbarians, bard, cleric, druid, fighter, monk, paladin, ranger, rogue, sorcerer, and wizard. Wizards encompass specialists in various schools of magic, illusionists and conjurers, for example. Clerics encompass priests of specific deities, with additional spells and powers tied to domains associated with their god. All spellcasters, bards, clerics, druids, paladins and rangers, sorcerers and wizards, have specific spell lists, although sorcerers and wizards share theirs. The core races harken back to 1st edition: human, halfling, elf, dwarf, gnome, half-elf and half-orc. Classes and races each have special abilities. In this edition, humans have additional skill points and feats to use over the other races, making them more versatile and somewhat balancing the abilities and bonuses possessed by the other races. Virtually all aspects of the game revolve around accumulating bonuses. This can be done by gaining levels, acquiring feats, improving ability scores, and so on. It can be done on a tactical basis through achieving favourable positioning against an opponent. More bonuses, more chance of beating the target numbers, and more chance of success. Speaking of target numbers, these are usually represented by a difficulty class. This is a number that must be equal to or exceeded by a 20-sided die roll plus modifiers. We've touched on this briefly. The difficulty class for any given situation is ultimately set by the Dungeon Master, but there are often hard rules to follow to do so. For example, when determining saving throw difficulty or performing specific tasks with certain skills. Sometimes the difficulty is set by a skill roll. For example, a character's hide roll acts as a difficulty for another attempted to spot him. Armour class is a difficulty class. Unlike previous editions, Armour class ascends as it improves. So, while 1st edition plate armour gave you an armour class of 3, 3rd edition will give you a base of 17 for half plate, subject for modifiers. This eliminates table lookup or THACO calculations. AC is directly the number that you need to beat to hit your target. All of this eliminates a lot of the confusion from earlier editions. Instead of non-weapon proficiencies, roll under, saving throws, roll over, and attacks, look up or calculate and roll over, using different procedures, you now have one mechanic for virtually everything. The mistake, in my opinion, that 3rd edition makes is then adding a whole new raft of complexity to the simple mechanic, requiring a number of factors to be accounted for to determine the final modifier used to the roll and the final target number. For example, in combat, the circumstances of an attack can contribute modifiers to both the attack roll and the target armour class. Since the two directly correlate, a +1 to AC is equivalent to a -1 to attack, for example, it may have been better to amalgamate all of these factors into, say, attack roll modifiers. For example, target behind cover, take a -4 penalty to hit them. Instead, the rules apply a +4 armour class bonus. I sneakily think that the separation comes more from the way that Rollmaster separates offensive and defensive bonuses, even though they are not used in precisely the same way. The skill system and the unified mechanics of the game allow players great freedom without stepping outside the structured game. A good example is in magic item creation. In previous editions, this was much more of a narrative rather than codified affair. Within 3rd edition, the specifics of manufacturing magical items is effortlessly built onto the core mechanic and principles. Character customization is even further enhanced with prestige classes. These are classes possessing restrictions and requirements that player characters can work towards. They narrow and hone the capabilities of a character. A generalist approach is also possible, with the multi-class process being as simple as deciding to take your new level in, say, fighter, rather than those wizard levels that you've been accumulating so far. The class combinations described in previous editions are promoted in 3rd edition with the concept of favoured class. Essentially, multi-class characters must keep the levels of the classes that they follow within striking distance of each other, except for their race's favoured class. Without going into a drawn-out breakdown of the mechanics, I think that's about it. Like Rolemaster, 3rd edition's underlying mechanics are really simple, with the complexity coming from the elements that are layered upon it. If you are mathematically minded, these complexities are a doddle. Most of the modifiers can be worked out in your head rather than looked up, and the tidier you are in noting your character's capabilities, the easier the whole thing becomes. If, on the other hand, maths makes your brain cells hurt, and you prefer character sheets that resemble the scrawling of a drunk spider, then you might have a difficult time with 3rd edition. I like 3rd edition almost for the same reasons that I like Rolemaster. It's a flexible toolkit that you can add or subtract to with ease because the underpinning mechanics are consistent and strong. This means it is a playground for new monsters, spells, classes, especially prestige classes, and so forth. And that is perfectly illustrated by the number of sourcebooks that expand the available selections. There is an information overload issue with the game as a whole, and I think many of the official Wizards of the Coast releases were either unnecessary or could have been condensed into more easily referenced works. That's forward planning and releases, I think. As an edition of Dungeons & Dragons, it's certainly up there in scope. It is not the easiest edition to play. While the core mechanics are easy to put over, the weight of the material can cause newcomers to balk. The true achievement of 3rd edition, however, is not particularly as an edition of D&D. Instead, it lies within the OGL and D20 licenses. From these sprang games such as Mutants and Mastermind and Spycraft. It kicked off the whole old-school Renaissance movement, the OSR, by opening things up to allow retro clones and variants to exist without fear of being sued. While many proponents of OSR are not fans of Wizards or later editions of Dungeons & Dragons, the enabling factors for it came along in 2000 with 3rd edition. It's not my favourite edition of Dungeons & Dragons, but it is nowhere near my least favourite. About mid-table. But its legacy far outstrips that. As a footnote, it's interesting that Dungeons & Dragons has only been outsold by another game once in its long history. That is, by the Pathfinder game during the era of 4th edition D&D. And Pathfinder, at least in its initial incarnation, is simply 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons rebadged. In fact, it was often nicknamed D&D 3.75. Regardless, the irony is, whether you want to call it Pathfinder or not, the time D&D was outsold, it was outsold by D&D. Pretty much the same as most editions of Dungeons & Dragons. The Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual, all of which are available as print-on-demand from Drive-Thru-RPG. To this, I would also add the Magic Item Compendium and Spell Compendium, with the Rules Compendium. Each of these are good collective works, and during play, the Rules Compendium is easier to reference than the Player's Handbook. If high level is your thing, then the Epic Level Handbook is worthwhile. Savage Species is a great addition for both player character options and for spicing up monster encounters. Everything else, superfluous. Some books are more useful than others. The Environment series, for example, make handy references, whatever edition of Dungeons & Dragons you're playing, or whatever game. Most of the books should be taken on a does my campaign need basis. Have a lot of dragons? Well, the Draconomicon may be really useful. Undead all over the place? Well, pick up Libris Mortis. Psionics your bag? Well, grab the expanded Psionics Handbook and perhaps complete Psionics. What I would really advise is Avoid getting snowed under. A game that sports 30 character classes and 350 prestige classes with 970 different feats, well, you will reap what you sow. Third edition is a good, flexible game, which can be seen simply by looking at its influence on later editions and the number of games that sprang from it. I think it is a little overcomplex for a Dungeons & Dragons edition, and much of it could have been simplified. But as a game unto itself, ignoring that it is an official Dungeons & Dragons edition, it excels as a 20-sided dice-driven alternative to Rollmaster. It is, after all, a fair attempt to amalgamate concepts from 2 games into one. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening or watching this review from 3rd edition. And stick with it. Subscribe if you like the content. And I look forward to, virtually meeting you when we head into other games and other concepts. In the meantime, subscribe, like, share, all that good stuff, and we'll see you next time.